Good morning, everyone. Doug Hansgate here. Thought I would bring you something a little bit different and a different use of some of the new tools we have available to us in Lightroom and Photoshop. So without further ado, let me jump into this. So what I have here is a photograph of a pileated woodpecker just on grass. He jumped out of the trees looking for some insects, and thought I would work with this for a second. So what I'm going to do here is take and first of all just do some standard adjustments in Lightroom. If I were to hit Command or Control I and bring up my information, you can see that this was shot with a ISO 6400. In fact, I'm going to go to the original image rather than this one. So this is my raw file, and I'm going to reset it. So again, ISO 6400, maybe first option would be to go and use the Lightroom new denoise function. So I'm going to just do exactly that. I generally find like between 45 and somewhere around 50 something, 62 is a good spot. I'm going to just set this at 50 and let this go and let this just take care of that ISO 6400 noise that's in there. Now, again, this is a raw file, so I can work with this raw file, and let's just see what auto would do. So just by hitting auto, it's going to brighten my image up and take care of some of the contrast issues that I have. I'm going to tweak it some from there. Looking at my histogram, I may want to increase the overall exposure a little bit and yet pull back on my highlights and my whites a little. So it's pushed the whites a little bit too much, I think. I want to just kind of kick exposure and maintain those whites where I have them. So I'm watching the histogram, and you know that we can control our Lightroom both through the histogram and or the sliders. So here, if I just take and move this end of my histogram, you see that I'm controlling just the whites. What I'm looking at is this particular spot right here on this pileated's chest. I want to make certain that that white doesn't get blown out. So by pulling that back a little bit and still increasing the exposure, I'm able to get a little bit better overall adjustment, I think. I'm going to open the blacks up a little bit here to try to get a little bit more detail and chest and shadows as well. So image is not bad. I could use a little bit of dehaze, my micro contrast adjustment, and a little bit of clarity to bring up the detail in her a little bit. I can also go to sharpening, increase my sharpening, and then by holding Alt or Option, I can drag up my masks so that I'm only sharpening mostly just the outside of her, a little bit of the grass in the foreground. And this is kind of where I would think about potentially sending this and using this technique that I'm going to suggest to you as an option. And that technique is to send this to Photoshop now. So I could go and say, let's go ahead and in Lighthouse, I could go and say Photo, Edit In, and send it to Photoshop. I usually use the shortcut key, Control or Command E, to send it to Photoshop with those Lightroom adjustments. Now I'm just going to jump over to Photoshop, and you see the image is here in Photoshop. Now the trick I wanted to show you today for Transform Tuesday was this. We have the ability to take and use our depth map that we could use in Lightroom, except that I'm going to approach it a little differently. So what I'm going to do is hit Command or Control J to duplicate my layer. I could have alternatively just dragged this layer down to a new layer, and it would have created a backdrop copy. Now I'm going to come up here and go to Filter, and I'm going to go to Neural Filters, because our depth map in Photoshop is found in our Neural Filters, and it's right down here, Depth Blur. And I'm going to turn it on. And when I turn it on, you'll notice this is quite a bit different than the depth blur that we see in Lightroom. And it has it has one big advantage that I'm going to point out here, and that is that I can, yes, change the focal distance like we could in Lightroom. I can change the range like we could in Lightroom. I could say just focus on my subject, and if I focus on the subject, it will reevaluate this and focus in on my bird, I would assume. And so there's my subject focus. Now we don't have the ability to necessarily look at the depth map like we do in Lightroom, but down here we can output a depth map only. So what I'm going to do is output the depth map only, and I get something that looks like this, which looks very similar to the depth map that we would see in Lightroom, and I'll show you that in a moment. However, there are a couple of differences with this, and the difference is, A, we're not seeing the color banding that we see in Lightroom, but B, I can output this depth map only. And so I can turn around and just say, okay, let's output that depth map. And what it does is it gives me that map as a separate layer in Photoshop. So there's a distinct advantage of that, because I can now make a selection of this depth map and use that selection for adjustments. So how do we do that? We go to the channels and we hold down Control or Command and we click on the RGB channel, and it gives us a selection. And you notice that the selection doesn't look great, but remember that our marching ants only show up, they don't show all of the ranges of the selection. And to prove that to you, I can save this selection. And it's always a good idea, once you make a depth map, to go ahead and save the selection. So I'm going to go up and say Select, Save Selection. And then I'm just going to type in depth map. And I'm going to put it onto a new channel. So there's my depth map saved. Now, if I go back to my Layers panel, and let's turn this off. What I'm going to do is make an adjustment using the depth map as a selection. So remember, we can make selections in lots of ways. We can select pixels. We can select luminosity using things like Tony Kuiper's luminosity masking, many other choices for using luminosity masks. But here we can make a selection based on depth. And that's really pretty neat, because here's what I can do now is I can come down here and choose to say use a curve. And you notice the mask down here. This mask is the mask that I got by selecting the RGB channel in the channels. And now I have a mask that is controlling this adjustment. So I can take this adjustment now, and in my properties of my adjustment layer, I can say, look, I really want to make this darker, or I want to make this brighter, and I can add contrast to this, and I can even do things like go ahead and change the tone. So let's find a spot which I think actually kind of works nice here. And what I'm looking to do is to create a little more separation between my subject and the background. Well, what I've done is just brighten the background. Instead of using depth blur to blur the background, which it did, I'm now using a curve to control the light qualities of that background, which is pretty darn neat, because now I can not only do a curve, but I could also say go, for example, to the green channel and say, look, I really want to take some of the green out of that background. And so here's the background before, and here's the background after. What it's done is it's created a beautiful separation of my subject from the background. And I've used that depth map in order to do that adjustment. Now I can eliminate this. This is doing me no good whatsoever, so I can just delete that layer. And then I can say, well, look, let's have some fun with this. Now that I have this depth map to work with, what if I were to take that depth map and put, say, for example, more blur on it, right? I can use blur as a choice. So I take this layer, which is just a copy of the background, and I'm going to take that layer and say filter blur, and I'm going to go and do like a lens or a Gaussian blur. Now I can blur the whole layer and blur the whole layer a lot. Now before I do that, I probably would like to make this layer a smart object. So let's convert to a smart object and then do that same thing. Blur, Gaussian blur. And the reason I want a smart object is that I really don't know how much blur I want on this whole image until I put my mask on. So let's use the smart blur function to help with that. Now I can take this mask and bring it down to blur, to hide the blur on this layer. So I hold Alt or Option, I drag this down and cover that blur with this mask. Now you'll notice that this mask, if I hold Alt or Option and just look at my mask, my black conceals, white reveals. The black is not concealing the bird totally, is it? Because it's a dark gray, but it's not pure black. So some of my Gaussian blur would have actually blurred this bird some. But now I can come to my mask, and by holding Command and Control, either L or M, whether you want a level or a curve, I'm going to do an L. What it does is it applies a levels adjustment to this mask. Now I can make my blacks darker and make my whites brighter. And I can move my center point so that my bird gets darker. So I don't want my bird, my pileated, to be blurred on this adjustment. So I'm going to modify that mask and make it darker. Now look at what happens. What I did was I darkened this mask so that this mask, this blur that I'm applying, does not apply to my bird. And now I can take and adjust my Gaussian blur kind of ad nauseum. Now, if in reality it's not pure black, so if I go too far, I start to see some of the blur on my pileated. It doesn't look good anyway, but this is a way to take and give us a little more blur and control that blur using Photoshop instead of using Lightroom to do this. Now, that being said, I could also, for example, come here and just simply say, look, let's go ahead and do a hue saturation adjustment. Hold Alt or Option and drag this mask onto that layer. Now I'm masking again for just the background. Remember, white reveals, black conceals. So when I do this saturation adjustment, I'm taking the saturation out of the background. If we take a look at before and after, here's before, here's after. So we used that depth map that's available to us from Photoshop, neural filters, depth blur, rather than using Lightroom's depth blur. There are some advantages to the Lightroom version, and I'm going to just hit Command Save here, and I'm going to go back over to Lightroom, and I want to show you what I mean by that. So let's go over here. Now this is the image. This is the image with noise reduction and depth blur done to it. So let's go ahead. This is the one that we just did. Let's go back to my original image. And this is just I want to get to the original image that has no blur. All right, so here's the original image, and we're going to go ahead and just denoise this again. And then I'm going to just make those adjustments that I did before. I'm going to pull back my whites a little bit. I'm going to open up my shadows, give it a little more contrast, a little more lightness here. And now let's just, without going into the detail and everything else, let's go and look at our lens blur on Lightroom. So if I apply lens blur here, there's a couple of differences between lens blur and Lightroom and in Photoshop. So first of all, we can adjust the blur amount in Lightroom, which is no big deal. It's just blurring the background more. We have a focus range which we can adjust here, and we can turn on visualize depth. This is what I was talking about as far as visualizing that depth. Instead of just a black and white mask showing you, they give you this color variance. So the purples down here are going to be blurred. This area is not going to be blurred, and the foreground is going to be blurred a little bit. So we can adjust this and make it so that our bird is our predominant sharpness. And so we still have a sharp bird. Our background is going to go blurry, and our foreground is going to go blurry. And we can refine this by using the brush refinement tool, which we don't have in Photoshop. Surprising, but we don't. And here what I can do is paint more focus on or paint more blur. I'm going to paint some blur, and I'm going to just get a bigger brush here. And I'm going to just say, you know what, I don't need this to be blurred, or I need this to be blurred here, right? So I want this all to be blurred. So it's converting it into the purple instead of keeping it in the white, or in this yellow in the front. But it's still going to give me more blur here along that line. So let's go ahead and just uncheck the visualize and see what's happening. So now we have this beautiful blur, but there's no way for us to generally make adjustments on that blur based upon that selection. We can change the bokeh, we can change the blur amount, but this selection of this depth map can only be done through Photoshop. So I hope this has helped you today. I hope that it's given you some fun things to think about, because it's given us a new way of making selections that we did not have in the past. If you're interested in more of my things, you can check out my YouTube channel. You can also check out handsgate.com. I teach classes all the time in Lightroom and Photoshop, a little bit different than anybody else in the industry, meaning that my classes are open, mics are open, you will talk to me, you will ask me questions, and I edit your images, not mine. I hope you enjoyed this. If you're interested, you can see more about myself and the Photo Guild, which has a sign behind me. The Photo Guild is an online camera club that meets every Thursday night throughout the year from September to June. And we do these types of things every Thursday night for 3 hours. So I hope that you can join me there as well. And have a great day.